Next one is on something that has come up on a number of occasions, people talking about hybrid warfare and all of this, information, cyber wars, AI, and disinformation. And to moderate it is Meurmishvili from Voice of America. Delighted you're here. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, David. And I must compliment you on pronunciating my last name, because it's usually last name. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us after lunch. Meurmishvili with the Voice of America, but I must make this disclaimer that views throughout this conference expressed by me are my personal and not those of US government or the organization. So with that, we can get started now. Before we start, we have a very, very interesting and distinguished panel here today, as you can probably see who they are. But before we start, there are a couple data points that I'd like to kind of remind you about. One is that average time we spend, or average time span, attention span, is about 8 seconds of an average person. So that creates an incredible amount of competition and sort of competition for attention and for media, for other different sources, which then we need to keep in mind for disinformation, whoever gets through those 8 seconds is the one who's having the attention. But with that also, a fun fact that you may remember for the future is that with this 8 seconds now, which has been decreasing, by the way, over the years, human species are behind the goldfish, who has 9 seconds of attention span. So a fun fact and a point of reference at some point to keep in mind. So with this in mind, how we're competing and how we're living with the information space and different sources and streams and all kinds of different information that comes in, then we're surrounded constantly with information. And it's changing not only our social, personal, professional lives, but also changes the warfare, how we manage ourselves as a society, how we compete on the global stage. So because of that, let me just introduce my panel to start with. Gigiadze is the EPRC, proud representative. Alina, who is the Center for European Policy Analysis, President and CEO. And we have Conrad Prince, who's a UK-Georgia Cyber Partnership, BAE Systems. And I would like to start with you, Conrad, if I may. If you were to give us a general, very broad overview of, particularly with the emphasis on cyberspace and cyber warfare, who are the actors that we're talking about? Who are the most powerful actors, and what's their goal in this sort of confrontation?
Sure, well, thank you very much, and it's great to be here. So to talk about sort of hostile states operating in cyber, and I think it is, there are distinctions between cyber and disinformation, and that will sort of play through, but I'm going to talk about cyber. I think normally we would talk about 4 key hostile actors, so Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, and they all operate in different ways in cyberspace. So Russia is a kind of full-spectrum hostile cyber actor, has been for many, many years. Large-scale espionage and kind of the exploitation of cyber and the internet for espionage is a major issue for all of us. So lots of Russian espionage, but also Russian information operations to disrupt democratic processes in many democratic countries. And also at the sort of extreme end of the spectrum, we've seen a number of Russian operations over the years to have destructive and disruptive effects. So, most infamously perhaps in Ukraine, the disruption of Ukrainian power supplies in 2014, but also using cyber attacks to disrupt media organizations, to disrupt big global events, to disrupt petrochemical plants, for example, with the intent of causing significant damage and disruption. So I think that's sort of Russia's breadth of operations, and we've also seen Russia using cyber in Ukraine, and we'll maybe come on to that in a minute. I think they do this for multiple motivations. I think a lot of the disruption operations are really to have a psychological effect on populations, to instill fear, to instill uncertainty. Their operations are about reducing confidence in our democratic processes, as well, of course, as having physical effect in real-world situations, as we've seen in Ukraine. China is a different kind of actor. China much less interested in destructive cyber operations, but has enormous espionage capabilities, including industrial espionage, intellectual property theft. Well observed when China's engaging in Belt and Road initiatives, for example, that you have spikes in Chinese espionage targeting and supporting their commercial activities. But beyond that, there's a much bigger challenge with China around technology, China's increasing dominance in the technology environment, how we secure our supply chains, how we can manage the risk of Chinese dominance, and indeed how China is seeking to change the nature of the internet itself. So that's a really strategic challenge. Then I think to finish off, Iran, very interesting cyber actor, been active aggressively for a very long time, using destructive cyber attacks, including targeting Western interests. They've used cyber to try to disrupt water treatment plants in Israel, for example, and there's a kind of Israel-Iran cyber tit for tat. Just recently, they attacked the Albanian government and seriously disrupted Albanian government IT networks, presumably as a reprisal for Albania hosting Iranian oppositionists. So they're an active player in the field that we shouldn't forget about. And finally, North Korea. I mean, North Korea has used cyber for information operations techniques. I mean, we think of the Sony hack of a number of years ago, but bluntly, they're using it to steal money and raise money, and they're quite focused on Bitcoin at the moment, for example. So those are the big players. The final point I'd make is then there's everybody else. And I think one of the challenges that we're facing now is the proliferation of cyber attack tools, of malware, the availability of these tools increasingly on the open market, and the fact that the bar of entry for many countries to engage in some quite sophisticated cyber operations has reduced significantly. And that's a real policy issue for us, I think, all.
And Alina, if I may come to you now, to take it into a different direction. So cyber, and as Conrad said, we're talking a few different things that kind of work together, and disinformation is one aspect of it. So is AI, that we have not really sort of scratched the surface of yet. So if you were to sort of give us an overview of where do you see the role of AI in disinformation? We have, earlier when we spoke, we talked about how content of the disinformation has not changed. It's the method of delivery that's been changing. So if you could speak to that in sort of general overview.
No, thank you for that fantastic and big question, Iya. That's going to be very easy to answer. And just, also want to thank Nino and McCain Institute and everyone and the Bush Center for this amazing, amazing conference. I'm so happy to be back in Tbilisi, in this beautiful country. But to get to the point, as I was listening to Conrad speak on cyber and describing the various threat vectors from state actors, and these usual suspects haven't changed in a long time. We've known that these are the countries that are increasing their investment in sophisticated cyber capabilities. Sandworm, for example, the Russian cyber threat actor, just recently was once again called out for attacking Ukraine in intelligence gathering information. It just keeps going. But in many ways, I think cyber, in the narrow sense of the word, has been a success case in terms of our ability to identify, attribute far more quickly, and to defend. And I think Ukraine, in so many ways, we've been talking about the security and military dimension, but also in this particular case, in the cyber defense space, has been a huge success. And I think that is something we need to take a lot of lessons from, because our own countries in the West are incredibly susceptible. And I think it's interesting that since last year in February, I think it was Google that put out a really interesting report a couple of months ago that looked at various threat actors in the information space and the cyberspace, and who were they attacking. Ukraine, number one, and they looked at all threat actors that Conrad was describing, and NATO countries, right? Both in the information space and the hard cyberspace. But I think in the information environment, we haven't had a success case. In fact, I would say it's been a huge failure because, as you've said, Iya, the playbook has remained the same for all eternity. The Soviet playbook is the Russian playbook, is the authoritarian playbook. How you manipulate populations, how you manipulate narratives in your favor. And what is changing is the rapid evolution of technology that allows for the distribution and amplification of that content. But the content itself is meaningless, and I think this is the key point that we have missed. You know, we all remember having our hair on fire about deepfakes. This is the AI-empowered synthetic video, audio, and other content years ago. I recall writing several papers about this. Some of them were wrong, some of them were not, in hindsight, in around 2017, 6 years ago. And it really hasn't, it's not a dog that has barked, right? We're all worried that AI was going to supercharge this information, make it so much easier to mislead people. It really hasn't happened. And you know, Chat GPT was a wake-up call for all of us, I think, because the ability to produce text and the access to average individuals to be able to do it has skyrocketed. But so far, not much has happened. You know, and I think, to my mind, the big problem we're facing now is, one, we're still focused on content, and we're not focusing on the distribution amplification technologies because we don't really understand them, frankly. But at the same time, as the majority of the population now has direct access to be able to use AI-powered capabilities. This is a huge inflection point, and it's why AI is such a huge issue in the United States in particular right now. But we don't really know what the consequences will be because we never dealt with the original sin, if you will, which is to focus on the distribution. And look, companies now, you know, look at Twitter or X, right? They stopped moderating content. Yes. And it just shows you what can happen when we basically leave the companies to be good players. Well, one company gets sold, and then the new head of the company, in this case, the infamous Elon Musk, decides he doesn't care about disinformation. And now Twitter has become this horrible platform. And it's happening all across the board, on every single platform, every single social media, because we never addressed the original problem. And that is, how do we actually think about building rules of the road around distribution that can address new changes in technology. Right now, we have no clue, frankly, how to regulate AI.
Let's come back to the big tech sort of role in all this, but I do want to come to Gigi now. After hearing all this, now Georgian perspective, or your perspective of what you see in Georgia from this environment. So one arguable assumption we can make is that winning in the cyber space or cyber warfare is equally, if maybe not more important than winning the hot war. Not saying that one is less important, but they're equally important. Yeah. And Georgia, even though there is no hot war happening here, it's a battleground for so many conflicting ideologies, aspirations, narratives. So what do you see in Georgia from this perspective? And how would you describe what's happening in Georgia from the disinformation perspective?
Thank you very much. Thank you for this question. I would like to thank also our friends, McCain and Bush Institute, for organizing this event with us. It's a great honor and pleasure to be hosting you again in Tbilisi for the second time. Georgia is one of the most vulnerable countries right now in the vicinity of Russia, because since the 2008 Russian-Georgian war, Russia uninterruptedly continues the hybrid warfare against our country, and we are facing constantly different kinds of cyber attacks, operational attacks, and the most unfortunate development recently is that the narratives and messages which Russia tries to spread in Georgia have been taken by the current ruling party. So we The latest attack against the Georgian cyberspace took place in 2019 on 28th of October, and just this year, I was just telling to Conrad, the Meta, the Facebook concern, closed more than 80 Facebook accounts, and among them was the strategic communication department of the Georgian government. So this multitude of events which is influencing the situation in Georgia is really very damaging for the country. I mean, we need to distinguish two spaces. First of all, this is before the war in Ukraine, before the Russian invasion in Ukraine. We had more or less calm narratives, and we knew what Russia was trying to achieve in Georgia. It was to impose this so-called new reality, to say that now we have these three so-called countries, meaning our occupied territories of Abkhazia and Skrine Valley region, and not only abroad, but they were trying to do it in Georgia as well. But after starting the war in Ukraine, the colors shrank, and now we have a very clear narrative of the Russian special agencies like GRU and military intelligence units, who are just adopted and applied by the ruling party in Georgia, which I think is very much visible for everyone in this country. The new technologies we're discussing here, I think we need to pay the huge attention for that, because, as I mentioned already, Georgia has to be the testing ground for the Russian hybrid warfare for a long time. Everything what is used now in Ukraine or elsewhere in the world has been tested in Georgia first and then reapplied to other countries. So I think if the technology will allow, Russia will not hesitate to experiment with us. And once again, Georgia doesn't have the capabilities to somehow deter these kind of attacks.
I do want to pick up on the technologies and what Russia is doing, is not doing, how we see what Russia is doing and what the threats, potential threats are, as opposed to what we see. So how would you see, Conrad, what can you say about Russian capabilities, first of all? Where are they demonstrated most of all? And have we seen everything that we could potentially, possibly, God forbid, see from this actor?
Yeah, I think that's the big challenge, really. I mean, it's very hard to know, what capabilities are held by Russia that they haven't deployed yet, that they've chosen to hold back for another occasion or another purpose. And so I think it's very, very difficult to kind of set the right of arc, if you like, and say, well, we know the extent of what they have. I mean, my experience over many years is that Russia's been pretty sophisticated in terms of developing cyber espionage and other cyber capabilities. I mean, I talked previously about some of their destructive attacks, but I mean, just on the espionage side, if you look at an attack like SolarWinds, which you remember from a couple of years ago, from my perspective, a pretty effective so-called supply chain attack, whereby they attacked an American tech company in order to be able to reach all of that tech company's customers, I think 18,000 potentially, get malware down on their network, so you've suddenly hit a whole range of different organizations, and you can then pick and choose who you want to carry on espionage operations with. Now, those kind of supply chain operations, they're good mainstream, sophisticated espionage, and I think that's the kind of thing that Russia is capable of. In destructive attacks, as I said, we've also seen Russia more, I think, than any other hostile country using destructive attacks to affect operational technology, so the technology that runs power stations, that runs the energy network, that runs our critical infrastructure. And we've seen in Ukraine, we've seen highly likely an attack on a petrochemical plant in Saudi Arabia some years ago, where they're doing some quite capable and effective things to disrupt and damage physical systems in the real world. So I would say that that's a pretty good, sense of the spectrum of capability, but I think it's very hard for us to know. And I think one of the challenges in Ukraine, and maybe we'll come back to that in a second, but I agree with Alina that Ukraine is a great success story for the Ukrainians from the point of view of cyber defense. But one of the challenges there is knowing, well, Was that everything Russia had to deploy from a cyber point of view in Ukraine? I personally very much doubt it. I can think of a number of reasons why you'd hold back certain capabilities, you wouldn't use them. So I think we need to be very concerned and can't be complacent about the extent and the range of Russian capabilities in a kind of full spectrum sense.
Yeah. I want to come to you now to sort of respond to that in a way that, are we doing enough, first of all, to know what their capabilities are? Is it possible to know that at all? And what would you like to see the Western community or the free world do to sort of mitigate this risk down the road?
I mean, Conrad is right that in this particular, in the world of black cyber ops, whether that's for espionage and intel gathering or for attacks and harm, it's very difficult to know. But I think we often commit the failure that we committed with overestimating Russia's defense and military capabilities. And I wonder if we're not doing that in the cyber domain as well. We're assuming, perhaps, that they're holding back, and that could be strategically smart, though the Russians have not been particularly strategically savvy in many, many occasions. So I'm not sure. I think we are overestimating. And again, we get into the same, I think, debate that we get in defense and security. We're afraid of retribution. We're afraid to get on the offense. And it's long overdue that we stop thinking about cyber only from the perspective of cyber defense, which is, I think, the more traditional way of thinking about it. How do you build resilient systems? We have to get on the offense. And that has to happen in the cyber domain. And it is happening more now. This used to be heresy to say this, that we have to deploy our cyber offense capabilities in the West. Not anymore. I think now people are coming to terms with this in the US and in the information space. We have been in reactive mode for years when it comes to dealing with Russian disinformation, whatever we call it, information ops. And where has it gotten us? It hasn't actually changed the underlying problem. And I think now we have a real opportunity with these new technologies being deployed. In 2017, Putin said, "He who controls AI will control the world," or something like that. And I think at the time, everyone was like, "Oh, he's brilliant, 2017. We weren't even thinking about AI in 2017. Well, like many things that Mr. Putin has said in the past, it wasn't a particularly brilliant or strategic statement, because the truth is no one controls AI. It is a technology that will affect every sector, every single sector of our lives, including the communication and information space. And we have a real opportunity here to not repeat the mistake we committed in the disinformation space, right?
So be more
broadly.
proactive.
Exactly. And I think we also are so worried that AI is going to destroy the world, right? Well, it's going to also do a lot of good. And the sooner that we can get AI tools in the hands of independent media, in the hands of civil society and democracy fighters, give them the opportunity to learn how to use these tools to defend themselves from information attacks and to get on the offense. I mean, this is how you get this issue right. And I'm just afraid that it hasn't quite sunk in what a profound moment we have right now, and that this window of opportunity is not going to be that wide. So I'm not sure if I actually answered your question, but there you go.
You created more questions in my mind. But I'd like to come to Gigi now, again, to sort of follow up the same line, but from Georgia's perspective. How is Georgia using, if at all, technology to protect its own cyberspace, protect its own, or ensure its own cybersecurity? Do we have any mechanisms? Do we have any partner countries that are helping us with this?
Yes, we have. We have since July 2008. This was the first cyber attack of Russia against Georgia 3 weeks prior, before the military invasion into Georgian territory. And afterwards, immediately, Georgia established collaboration with Estonia, Sweden, and Great Britain. If I'm not mistaken, Conrad will know it better. But we are mirroring all our web pages with those countries, and in case of the cyber attack, they can immediately relaunch our web pages from their own territory. So I think in that regard, Georgia needs closest possible cooperation with its allies and partners, because alone Georgia will not be able to deter the threats emanating from Russia. So therefore, what we can do right now to be in a very close contact with with European countries, with our United States partner, and to do it together. I mean, alone it will be very difficult, and I think pricey for Georgia to.
If not impossible. Right?
Yeah, I think if not impossible.
The-
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, I just wanted to say that messages and narratives which Russian propaganda is trying to achieve in Georgia is also very interesting because they are trying to diminish the support of the Georgian society towards the West, so towards the European Union and NATO. So this is one of the main objectives which is followed by the disinformation and propaganda in Georgia. So therefore, we need as much support as possible from our Western friends.
I'm tempted to ask you about Georgia, but I also want to ask you about Ukraine. So let's go with Ukraine.
Yeah, well, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but please, if you have anything
Yeah.
to talk about Georgia, please do. But let me ask you a question about Ukraine. We talked about some of the, Alina's talking about being more proactive and going on offensive. Ukrainians have shown tremendous resilience, and we called it a success story here. So what is this success? How are they successful? What are they doing, and what are some of the tools and technology and thought process they use to defend themselves in the cyberspace?
And just to start on Georgia, and I think in the UK, we're very committed to supporting Georgia, supporting the development of cyber resilience in Georgia, and in doing that, we bring together UK government, UK private sector, civil society groups, to work together and help build that resilience. Because I think that, my personal view is kind of, in the case of cyber attack, defense is the best form of defense. And it's absolutely critical that states invest significantly in increasing the cyber resilience of government and of critical infrastructure. And this is a really complex thing to do because, of course, most of our critical infrastructure sits in the private sector's hands. Its security is the responsibility of the private sector. So you get into this kind of whole complex set of relationships between government and private sector and civil society as to how you build national resilience. But that's absolutely fundamental because that's going to be the key thing to protect us. I think Ukraine proves that point. In many ways, the Russians shot themselves in the foot, I think, because their long-term cyber attacks against Ukraine prompted the Ukrainian government to invest significantly in cyber defense and cyber security. And they had support from the United States, the United Kingdom, the EU, and from the private sector. And so they built up their cyber resilience and cyber expertise and cyber capability over a number of years. And I think the general consensus now, this is what I think I agree with Alina, is that that's been critical in the success of Ukraine in defeating what has been, quite a large number of attempted Russian destructive cyber attacks. I mean, I think the attack on Viasat, the satellite communication system, probably the most successful Russian attack, but there have been many attempts to use so-called wiper attacks to disrupt Ukrainian systems that have failed. And I think it's a testament to the strength and the effectiveness and the skill of Ukrainian defenders. But also critical there has been the support from Western governments in providing capability, advice, technology, and the role that multiple different elements of the private sector have played in, for example, helping Ukraine get a lot of its data on the cloud, in providing, quite quickly, rapidly, quite detailed technical incident response capabilities and cyber defense capabilities. And I think there's been a really positive example of the collaboration between governments and the private sector and the Ukrainian government, very much on point with this and very closely engaged with it, to help strengthen further Ukraine's resilience. And that model of how you have governments, private sector, international support coming together in a coherent way to build cyber resilience is the way you do it, in my view. And of course, Ukraine's had to do it in the fulcrum of this terrible war. But all nations, that's the model we need to follow. Governments can't do it alone. The private sector can't do it alone. There has to be coherent joint effort underpinned by incentives and regulation and all kinds of structures that bind and build those different stakeholders together.
I just want to jump in here because we started talking about the role of the private sector, and I'm so glad that Conrad brought this up because this is what I wanted to really put an emphasis on, because I think Ukraine and what the Ukrainians have done so effectively is bring together this public-private partnership in a way that I don't know if any other country has done under the most dire circumstances. I remember at the beginning of the war, I was in a conversation with a bunch of cyber nerds, if you excuse me, and people were predicting that there was going to be, before the military invasion, there was going to be kind of a cyber invasion to precede it, 48 hours, kind of studying the theater. And then in hindsight, it's like, well, that was the dog that also didn't bark. My argument is also, if you look at the data, you made this point, is that dog has barked.
Yeah, absolutely.
And very, very loudly, because there have been a constant barrage of cyber attacks on Ukraine, and they have defended themselves incredibly effectively. And I think the issue we face in the West, as we're thinking about regulation, right, there is this strong political incentive to beat up on companies. But the two companies that Ukraine's government actually awarded for everything they've done in support of Ukraine's resilience was Google and Starlink. American companies, you may think whatever you like about them, but this to me is the evidence that the United States in particular is leading the innovative edge. We have the opportunity now to learn how the Ukrainians have done this, and we have to really think about regulatory efforts as a scalpel. Because we, at this moment, want to regulate everything and everyone and break up companies and all of this, which this is not a conversation about competition, but we also have to understand how we utilize the huge competitive advantage we have over Russia and over China and use it effectively with Ukraine as the blueprint. So I think this is where we need to go, because often we have these panel conversations like, oh, we got to do this, oh, we got to do that. How do you do it? This is a very obvious blueprint. Then you start to develop tools, get them in the hands of civil society, independent media. This should be part and parcel of every single international aid package for independent media, is developing tech-driven, effective tools that support independent research, that support human rights, and that support democracy. And I think that is where we need to go, and things are slowly moving in that direction. I think my concern is that it's just far too slow, while every single company, from startup to the biggest companies in the world, are implementing and rolling out AI double time.
Yes.
And we're just observing from afar right now.
Gigi, do you see any private-public partnership in Georgia as
I can hardly imagine that, but would be good. But that for the time being, I don't see that.
So the government is the sole sort of responsible party.
Yes, this is the area which hasn't been even touched here. I think the PPP is far away from here, but would be a good possibility, of course, to tackle these kind of challenges.
Conrad, I want to come back to China and the technological sort of offensive, if we may call it this way, that China sort of pushing throughout the world. And Georgia recently signed a strategic partnership with China, which down the road could possibly involve some of the technological cooperation with China as well. So in particularly, I'd like for you to kind of give us an overview of the role of Huawei in the large scheme of things as we talk about cyberspace and cyber warfare and informational advantages over your adversaries and competitors. Where does China stand in Europe, in Ukraine, and what's sort of your general view of that?
So I think there are sort of two dimensions to the China tech issue that I would draw out. I mean, the first is the deep penetration and dependence on China-generated technology, which we've wrestled with in the United Kingdom and is a significant issue in the global South, across the world, really. And I think there are a number of issues there. I mean, clearly, we are rightly concerned about the national security implications of having Chinese technology in very sensitive parts of our critical infrastructure, our telecommunications infrastructure, or emerging Internet of Things technology, and so on and so forth. I think, ironically, one of the things that we found in the UK perhaps was that the biggest risk from this was just that a lot of the technology wasn't very good.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily so much that this gives the Chinese some tremendous all-seeing power to, turn off the lights in London at will, but it's actually meaning that we're importing quite poor quality technology extensively into our infrastructure, which is full of security vulnerabilities, which any hostile actor, including China, but any hostile actor can exploit. And so, that's a challenge that we've wrestled with. We've looked at, and it's a risk management challenge. You can't simply ban Chinese technology wholesale. So I think it's about thinking very hard as to where in our critical infrastructure we cannot afford to see Chinese technology, about where we can manage that risk and how we manage that risk. And of course, that's the position that we ended up with on 5G telecommunications technology. What I've seen over a number of years as I've traveled around, in the Middle East, in Asia Pacific, is, the deep penetration of Chinese technology companies like Huawei and ZTE, as part of a broad Chinese government agenda, coming into countries, providing technology solutions very cheaply or for free. And the countries that one visits in these regions, they understand that there are risks that come with that. But in many cases, they're willing to live with those risks because they get very cheap, broadly usable technology, and there isn't a great deal that we in the West, if you like, are offering as an alternative. So I think there's a deep set of challenges for us there around our technology supply chain. The other thing that I would cite around China is more in the nature of the future of the internet and how the internet and technology is shaped in future. So the internet and security standards and internet standards are set by a multiple range of standards development organizations. Some of them, like the ITU, are quite government heavy. Some of them are very, very multi-stakeholder. And these are the bodies that essentially, they're quite sort of technical and arcane in many ways, but they are shaping the future of technology for us. Now, China has had a long-standing tactic of dominating these bodies. I think at one stage they chaired 80% of them or something like that, of getting in there, dominating them, and bringing their agenda and their vision for the future. And their vision for the future of the internet is not, the vision of a free, open, peaceful, and secure multi-stakeholder internet that we have. It's very much about state-controlled, authoritarian, really enabling state control of the individual citizen. And they have developed this in quite detailed technical terms. It's not just kind of arm-waving sort of rhetoric. It's quite detailed. And they're bringing these propositions into these standards development groups. And it's really important that we, in the democratic countries in the free world, counter that initiative. Because, a lot of what China has to offer to many countries, what some would call the mid-ground states, if you like, it's quite attractive. They quite like some cheap state-controlled technology. So there's a big challenge, I think, for those of us in the democracies to, counterbalance that. And that's why I think you'll see in the UK, the United States, and the EU, we're really focusing much more clearly on these standard development bodies. And again, it's a multi-stakeholder thing. The private sector have a strong voice in these bodies. Civil society have a voice in them. And we need to sort of pull those groups together, those like-minded groups who actually believe in our democratic values, to counter that Chinese influence. So it's kind of a strategic threat that operates, I think, at multiple different ways.
Let's give
sorry. I know. I want to go to the audience.
I will warn them that please prepare your questions. You have less than a minute. And Alina, you want to add something?
So on Conrad's point, on the ITU in particular, which is people see this as like this technocratic, nobody knows what it does. We have an American as the head of the ITU right now. And that was a hard-won battle against a Russian candidate. And there was no guarantee that the Russian, and that wasn't going to win. That would have been a huge disaster. But I think all these issues that we're talking about now and the broader conversation on this panel, I mean, the big, I think, vision that we have to work towards, that technology and questions around technology cannot be just relegated to niche technocratic conversation. Technology has to be the third foundation, together with defense and democratic values, of the alliance. And unless Europe, the United States, the transatlantic alliance gets this through our heads, and that we see commitment to defense, commitment to values, and commitment to a values-based tech regulation, not just internet. We're not just talking about the internet anymore. Then we're never going to get anywhere. And we're never going to be able to compete with China or other authoritarian states, which so far have failed completely to replicate a democratic model and a liberal economic model that has produced huge technological innovation in the West, and particularly the United States, right? I mean, Silicon Valley is the example, like Skolkovo has failed miserably in Russia, and China, just because of sheer size, is catching up, and they're actually eating our lunch on several technologies at this point, but we still have that window. And I think, again, this has been the work that we've been doing at SIPA, is like we need to think of these 3 pillars as the pillars of the alliance. And it's not about technocratic conversations, and it's not about these like, oh, standards say nobody knows what this means. We need to take the initiative to educate ourselves as professionals, as thinkers, as intellectuals, to understand how these things work. You don't have to know how to write code. I don't know how to write code. But you can understand the implications for defense and democracy. And I think it behooves all of us to just not be lazy about it.
Like, that's a great, yes, please. And then I'll come back to you, Batu. And then, let's take 2 questions at a time, please, because we have too many questions to get through.
Yes, I have a quick point. Gigi mentioned the investigation by Meta, Facebook, earlier this year in May. But an important thing, the key thing about this investigation was that first time ever, Meta said that the Georgian government's strategic communications department is the institution that is coordinating and executing anti-Western disinformation campaigns. That had never happened before, ever. And it's based on investigation. And to this day, this department is a partner of European Union and the United States government in countering disinformation. Something that they are funding this department. I mean, so it's just absurd. And another very quick point, memory. I didn't hear memory. One issue that the Russians have brilliantly and successfully weaponized in Georgia is the Soviet totalitarian memory, which they say is an incredibly important issue. Where is the memory here?
To go through. Thank you very much for your point. Batu, please.
We have 11.
Yeah, thank you very much. Fascinating discussion. You touched upon largely one of the components of cyber, which is, and the threats associated with it, it's a disruption, or physical disruption, attacks. But there is another component which might be not less, even maybe more dangerous, is harvesting big data and using it then to manipulate societies and processes. And while European Union, United States have national security screening for the foreign investments, countries like Georgia, we are more vulnerable. For example, recently 5G license from Georgian government with questionable transparent tender was awarded to the company that has beneficiary owners, direct and indirect, either Russian citizens or affiliated with Russia. So, and that has not got big traction simply because what Alina said, that this technology is somehow considered a distant problem for everyone. But with this type of ownership, this big data will be very effectively used by Russia to ease their task of keeping political processes or polarization or undermining, subverting countries' democracies very effectively. So what can countries like Georgia, Ukraine, who are not yet part of this bigger protection and the screening of foreign direct investments, protect ourselves, not to allow corrupt governments hand over this strategic infrastructure in the hands of Chinese or Russian investors?
Would you like to tackle this?
Well, I mean, just to respond to that, I mean, I think from the UK perspective, it's a real issue. We have strengthened our legislation around foreign direct investment recently. We have, and for us, I think the the primary focus is back to China, but not exclusively. And I think that we have recognized more clearly now that that foreign direct investment in emerging technology areas is a national security risk for us. I mean, to Alina's very powerful point, I think, one of the positive things we've seen in the UK is in our integrated review, our big strategy is much more recognizes the importance of technology and the importance of building technology bases in leading areas like quantum, for example, and AI. And so we're focusing much harder through legislation on how we control direct investment in some of those technologies. But I mean, fundamentally, it does also require a kind of analytic, capability to understand what these companies are, who they're linked to, who's behind them, and there has to be a will, I think, to put the effort and the resource into that sort of analysis, underpinned by legislation to enable you to manage and control that direct investment, foreign direct investment, where it presents a national security risk.
And I also think, to follow up on this point, this is a huge opportunity for the EU. Of course, the EU has been the global leader on regulation, if not technology innovation, to be honest. But the EU and the Commission has rolled out a huge number of regulatory proposals. Some have been enacted, some are being considered as we speak. And there hasn't been a proper national security lens to these, because they're coming, EU bureaucracy, they're coming from specific parts of the Commission. They're not being voted on for the national security lens. I think that is starting to change. But I think one of the biggest gaps I've seen in cooperation between Europe and the United States on tech issues has been a very different lens. In the US, national security kind of is the lens over everything, right? In Europe, it's been about consumer rights and privacy at the end of the day. And I think we need to really start to come to terms and close that gap, because some of the EU regulations, which are well-meaning to protect individuals, are actually producing vulnerabilities in data, vulnerabilities in the cyber domain. And this is just something so profound. And we're going to wake up one day and our adversaries are going to be exploiting those vulnerabilities. Because it's making some of our systems far less secure. Encryption is a big issue right now, and I know in the UK there's a big debate about this. But there's a huge opportunity here for the EU to lead on these issues in a thoughtful way that will bring the United States on board, because I don't think Washington is going to do anything, frankly. Maybe, but I don't think so.
Let's take 1, 2, and Michal. We have just a few minutes left, and please be short and concise with your questions.
Can do. Michael Bashir, Newsweek. I have a question about Russian Kremlin propaganda narratives. I think everybody here figured out pretty quickly that the narratives around MH17, around biolabs in Georgia and in Ukraine, those were false Kremlin propaganda narratives. It took a few years longer, but I think everyone here now sees that the narrative about NATO expansion was also a false Kremlin propaganda narrative. My question, how long is it going to be before we find out that the ideas that Putin invaded Ukraine because he was isolated and or misinformed and or intent on securing his historical legacy were also false Kremlin propaganda narratives?
Thank you. Yes, please. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is John Glenn. I'm at the National Endowment for Democracy. Let me thank you all for a terrific discussion. I'd like to pick up on Alina's point about the opportunity we have now to define the rules of the road and give you more airtime, push you a little bit to help us develop that. The conversation in it keeps reminding me of the discussion we had in 2011 around liberation technology, the Facebook revolutions, the Twitter revolution, where we thought these new technologies would be empowering citizens' voices, connecting them, and creating more democratic opportunity, when in fact, I think any sensible view would see that instead it's been premised around secrecy, surveillance, and control. So how do we define what are these democratic principles of the rules of the road? To be fair, I hear transparency is one of those critical features, but we'd love to have you develop that more for us.
Thank you.
Michał Baranowski, GMF, fantastic discussion. One quick practical question. Are we learning from Ukrainian war, from Russia's war in Ukraine, fast enough are we implementing this when it comes to cyber defense? And the second one, maybe specifically to Alina, is, we talked about, you mentioned the role of private sector, and I especially wanted to ask about the relationship between Washington and the Silicon Valley. One of the CEOs, I think, of Palantir called recently for basically creating a Manhattan project for AI. Yes. Do you think that something of that sort is important to bring Silicon Valley closer together on AI especially? Thanks.
Okay, let's start with you, Alina, because you were.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. I may start with John's very hard question. I don't think I'll be able to answer to your satisfaction, but I think what I see is that we have, certainly in the United States, legislators who are looking for a silver bullet for some big AI act. And the truth is, we're not going to get it. Because there's no way, there's no way to regulate the entire internet. You have to do it sector by sector. So, for example, AI is the most revolutionary technology. We're actually trying to find a historical example. Has there ever been something that is so rapid and is going to be so transformative for society at large? Maybe just the advent of the internet itself. This is that other point in the evolution. And we failed. We failed on the internet, frankly. So now I think we need to be much more strategic, because AI is going to be implemented, for example, in the medical field. We have rules to protect patients, their individual rights, their data, a ton of rules. We have rules in the financial sector. I think we need, rather than saying we're going to regulate AI, because frankly that is impossible, we need to start looking at what we already have in place in some very specific sectors and adapting these existing rules to apply to AI technologies, right? And I think what should be the guiding principles. I mean, we have that too. I mean, one example is the UN Charter on Human Rights. It's already there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. I think we think, oh, this is such a revolutionary thing, we have to reinvent the wheel. No, we don't. And these are things we can do much faster than having some sort of omnibus, silver bullet kind of legislation, which is never going to pass, I think, in the US Congress, given the patterns we've seen. So that's just some food for thought. And Michal, I know you had a question, and I wrote it down, but can you just tell me exactly what it was?
Are we learning from Ukraine war, basically, right?
Oh, we're learning. How we're learning from the Ukrainian
Are we
experience.
learning, and are we learning fast enough from the war in Ukraine?
I think the answer to that is no. I mean, I don't know what happens in the classified domain. A lot of this information is classified. But I think, like I said earlier, I mean, there's a blueprint there. The Ukrainians have been testing so many different technologies. I mean, in the defense and military domain, too, the deployment of drone capabilities. Drones that are no longer, individual to drone. Unmanned systems, right, that are also capable of some limited decision-making as a system. Mm-hmm. This is being deployed in theater as we speak by Ukrainians. And the DoD has finally woken up, and the Pentagon has woken up, and is investing very heavily in these new technologies and trying to implement, deploy them. But it's going to take a while, to move away from big, heavy things to much more consolidated, more effective, more efficient systems and capabilities. But the Ukrainians have done it. They're doing it. We literally need to be producing a blueprint. And maybe that's a project we can do together, Michal.
There you go. Conrad.
Yeah, so I think on learning the lessons, I mean, at the tactical level, I mean, there is a great deal of work going on to understand what's been happening in Ukraine, talk to Ukrainian counterparts, and we're seeing a lot of interesting thinking coming out of that. At the macro level, though, no, we're not learning those lessons quickly enough at all. Even in countries that have been investing in cybersecurity for over a decade or more, there are still significant vulnerabilities across our critical infrastructure. You see tremendous variety, so top-end financial services spend a lot of money, often not bad. Elsewhere, power, water, very, very vulnerable. It depends how these sectors work. A lot of them are, they don't have a large number of resources to put into cybersecurity. Cyber is often seen as a dragging anchor. It slows everything down. So, I think the key lesson of investing in resilience is something that we really need to significantly increase. The second key lesson is that has to be done between government and private sector together. and that has to be an effective partnership. There are still too many places where, frankly, you hear government really not taking private sector seriously. But I mean, in the UK, in government, our government doesn't have detailed expertise about cybersecurity in financial services sector. That expertise rests in those sectors. So we have to work with them, bring them in the tent, share information. These days, there's more data about cyber threat held by the private sector than by governments.
Yes.
And I mean, the latest American cyber strategy is explicit on that point. So even for the United States, that's a complete change in position from 5 or 10 years ago. So learning those kinds of lessons, building those kinds of partnerships is something we're not doing quickly enough as a set of democracies and like-minded nations.
If I may just answer the first question, how
yes.
long it will take until we understand these fake messages and propaganda? I think the world is waking up towards this Russian tools of the hybrid warfare. But I think the most important thing would be to have an agreement in a society from all stakeholders, what is wrong, what is false, what is lie, and to have very clear exposure, clear understanding of it. That's it.
And I am going to take a prerogative and go on a really 1 minute round, less if you can. The biggest challenge that you see looking forward and the solution to it. I know it's an impossible task to do in 1 minute, but in very broad terms. And Alina, if you would think about the same thing, and for Georgia as well.
So I think a big challenge that we're facing is the pace of new technology, the Internet of Things. We've talked about AI, we've name-checked quantum. The need for governments and private sector to get ahead of the pace of that, as Alina was saying, but also the need for us to find mechanisms internationally to ensure that security is built into these systems from the ground up, because we already exist with a massive legacy technology problem, that the technologies that we are dependent on today are full of holes, are deeply insecure. The risk is that we will build a new generation of technology, connected devices, Internet of Things, that is equally full of holes, that is equally very vulnerable, and we will have missed a critical opportunity to secure ourselves for the future. So, I mean, I can throw that in.
Alina.
I already said it, though, I think the biggest challenge is for democracies to get tech policy right, and to inject security into tech regulatory efforts. Every single tech regulatory proposal needs to put security first, and I do think that is changing. But we're so far apart. We're so far apart between Washington and Brussels, for example. And there's mechanisms to get it right, because if we don't, I mean, we're going to be in a very, very different world, and it's going to change much faster than we think. It's going to be much faster than what we saw with the advent of the internet.
I think the biggest challenge in Georgian case is the understanding of the importance of the cybersecurity, and understanding in the society how quickly it can influence the general situation in the country. I think this is the most important from the government side, to provide adequate information to the society, and also to adopt the tools which are quite feasible in the European Union and our closest European allies. This would be.
So we have a roadmap now, so let's get working. So thank you very much to the panelists.
Thank you,
It was very, very
Thank you,
Thank you.
Great panel. Thank you, Ia. Terrific job. Thank you very much.